opening the center and contesting key squares, preparing for swift development and a strong central presence. Unblocking the dark-squared bishop and preparing for kingside expansion creates immediate central influence. Instantly claiming central real estate, this solidifies the pawn's influence and prepares for further aggressive development, hinting at a more positional struggle. Embracing the fianchetto, black prepares to deploy the bishop to the long diagonal, aiming for kingside development and influence. Developing a knight here naturally contests the center and prepares for kingside castling, creating a solid pawn structure against black's fianchetto. Challenging the center immediately, black signals an intent to break open the pawn structure and activate pieces. Developing the knight shores up the center and prepares for castling, maintaining flexibility. Developing the bishop here solidifies control of the long diagonal, a crucial element in this king's Indian setup. Pinning the knight here aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially gain a tempo later. Boldly challenging white's central grip, this knight reorients for immediate kingside pressure and opens surprising avenues. Conceding central space, white prioritizes development and potential pressure on the d-file, daring black to prove their knight's advanced post is secure. Releasing the knight from its outpost, black exchanges the knight that was causing positional disruption, aiming to simplify the position and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares after white recaptures. This exchange might appear passive, but could be a calculated effort to achieve a more balanced middle game, freeing up other pieces for development. Recapturing the pawn opens up the kingside immediately, creating dynamic possibilities as white's knight now stands aggressively near black's castled position, potentially straining black's defensive resources. Opening the e-file offers immediate counterplay and aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure, though it also potentially exposes your own king to early complications if not handled carefully. Reclaiming the central square with the knight opens up lines for development and prepares to challenge black's bishop if it retreats, while also reinforcing white's control of the e5 outpost. Re-establishing central pawn presence after the exchange, this captures is a sound, principled decision to contest the open d-file and free the dark-squared bishop. Expanding the queenside aggressively, white aims to seize more territory and potentially create weaknesses in black's structure, forcing a more active defense. Developing the queen to d6 now connects the rooks and prepares for potential castling, while simultaneously eyeing the potentially weakened central pawns of white and offering a stable outpost for the queen should the center simplify. Preparing to anchor the queenside expansion, white secures the b4 pawn against any immediate and b6 threats, and subtly prepares for a potential b5 push to gain more territory and restrict black's pieces. Castling securely tucks your monarch behind a pawn wall, a crucial defensive maneuver that simultaneously activates the rook for potential central action. Solidifying the center and preparing for pawn advances, this maneuver establishes a robust pawn structure while keeping options open for future pawn chains on the kingside, potentially targeting black's castled position. Solidifying the central pawn structure, this move aims to anchor the d5 pawn and prepare for future expansion on the queenside, potentially targeting white's b4 pawn. Orienting the bishop towards the kingside, this move prepares for potential kingside action or a strategic repositioning, while also offering better diagonal control and reinforcing the central pawn structure. Developing the bishop to f5 immediately challenges white's central pawn structure and prepares for potential pressure on the d4 pawn, while also opening a diagonal for the queen. Securing the monarch within the castle walls, a fundamental defensive maneuver, now allows white to reevaluate its central pawns and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the queen's side or king's side, aiming to generate space and activate pieces. Activating the knight to d7, the intent is to prepare for the knight's eventual redeployment to c5, where it can exert pressure on white's central pawn structure, particularly eyeing the d4 pawn and potentially supporting a b5 pawn push to gain queenside space. This knight maneuver also subtly creates a potential battery with the queen on d6 aimed at the king's side, should circumstances allow. A bold assertion of queenside space, This knight migration aims to challenge black's robust central pawn structure and create a versatile outpost on c5, potentially cramping black's development and limiting their piece's scope. Launching an assault on the queenside, this pawn thrust directly challenges white's queenside expansion and aims to create immediate dynamic imbalances, potentially liberating black's queenside pieces. Unlocking queenside play, the white queen ventures to a3, aiming to exploit the potentially weak b4 pawn and create attacking pressure on that flank, while simultaneously bolstering the defense of the king. Seeking to disrupt white's queenside structure, black pushes the b-pawn, aiming to create an outpost for the knight on c4 or to exchange it for white's pawn and open the b-file. This pawn thrust immediately challenges white's control of the center and the queenside, potentially forcing concessions or creating new tactical possibilities. The tension between the queenside pawns intensifies, and white must now decide whether to accept the challenge by capturing on b5 or to maintain the current pawn structure, which might lead to a more closed position. This aggressive advance signals black's intent to seize initiative. The knight's repositioning to the center injects immediate dynamism, aiming to exploit the weakened d5 pawn and potentially create advanced outposts on e6 or c4, while simultaneously challenging black's developing pieces and threatening to disrupt white's queenside expansion. Black aims to restrict white's queenside expansion and create counterplay, but this ambitious pawn push might overextend the kingside defenses, creating potential weaknesses if white can exploit the newly opened lines with aggressive piece play. Unlocking the queenside by daring to exchange the knight for a pawn creates interesting outpost possibilities on d5, but it also sacrifices the initiative, inviting black to solidify their position and prepare for potential counterplay. The knight's journey to b6 aims to disrupt white's queenside grip and potentially exploit the weakness on c5. Initiating a strategic repositioning, white redirects the knight towards the kingside, seeking to exploit the potentially weak light squares around black's king and prepare for a more active role in the center or on the queenside as the game evolves. Preparing to wrestle for central influence, black repositions the rook to a more active file, anticipating potential clashes along the e-file and adding pressure towards white's kingside should the center open. Unlocking the e-file for enhanced pressure, white prepares to concentrate forces on the kingside and central squares, anticipating a potential exchange sacrifice down the line to pierce black's defenses. Reasserting presence on the open e-file, this maneuver aims to leverage the newly available space, preparing a potential rook lift to the kingside or a central advance, while also offering support to the knight on d7 should it decide to relocate. Unlocking the kingside with the bishop repositioning is a clever way to prepare for potential advances and connect the rooks, while also eyeing the potentially weakened dark squares around black's monarch. Shifting the rook from the e-file anticipates a potential exchange or allows for regrouping, sensing the pressure building on that open file, while also preparing to contest the more critical d-file later. Building a pawn wall on the kingside aims to create a secure haven for the monarch, but this particular maneuver risks generating significant weaknesses by inviting black's pieces to infiltrate the newly formed structure. The bishop now endeavors to escape the pawn chain's restriction, seeking an active outpost on the kingside, hinting at a potential repositioning to pressure white's central pawns indirectly or even join a future kingside attack. Challenging the bishop's entrenched position on h3, this retreat by white seeks to re-establish harmony among its pieces, particularly by freeing the f3 square for the knight and preparing a more cohesive defense around the king. Sacrificing the bishop opens up a diagonal for white's queen, but more importantly, it removes a key defensive piece from black's castled position. Consider how this changes the pawn structure. The g-file is now partially open, a potential target for an attack on the king. Also, observe how the exchange simplifies the position, perhaps leading to an endgame where black's knight might find excellent outpost squares. Think about the long-term consequences of this bishop trade. Does it create weaknesses or offer new opportunities for counterplay? Unlocking a slightly more active king, white injects a dose of dynamism, preparing to potentially deploy this piece to a more central and influential square later in the game. Unleashing the kingside pawn storm, f5 initiates a daring expansion, aiming to break open lines and exploit the semi-open g-file, while simultaneously creating an outpost for the knight on e4 should it find its way there. This aggressive maneuver fundamentally alters the pawn structure, injecting immediate dynamism into the position and forcing white to confront a sudden surge of central and kingside activity. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, white seeks to create immediate attacking chances against black's uncastled king. The pawn advance, h4, is an aggressive declaration, aiming to pry open lines and gain crucial space for white's attacking pieces. This territorial expansion on the flank is a bold attempt to unbalance the position and force black onto the defensive. The opening of the h-file, however potential, also signals a commitment of resources and could become a target if black can counter effectively. White is essentially betting on the speed of their kingside assault to overwhelm black's solid central structure. This maneuver directly challenges the current equilibrium, suggesting white is dissatisfied with the slow maneuvering and seeks a more dynamic game. The move creates a potential weakness on g4, but white's intention is to exploit the resulting open lines rather than defend that square. The strategic idea is to disrupt black's king's safety by creating threats that demand immediate attention. An audacious dive into the enemy camp, the knight aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially create tactical fireworks with its newfound outpost, though it risks isolation if white can effectively contain it. White repositions the knight to its initial square, a seemingly passive retreat that subtly reclaims central influence and prepares for a potential regrouping of pieces. This maneuver clears the way for other pieces to potentially occupy the f3 square, and it allows the knight to eye the e5 square, a vital central outpost that black has been attempting to control. It's a quiet move, but it's about maintaining flexibility and ensuring no weaknesses are created unnecessarily in white's own position, while also keeping options open for future play. Bishops often seek more scope. Repositioning the king's defender here aims to activate it and potentially challenge white's central pawn structure after a future f5-f4 advance, which could open up lines. Rerouting the rook towards the kingside might be the intent, potentially preparing for an e4 push or simply bolstering kingside defense. The rook's repositioning to the g-file aims to add pressure on white's kingside and potentially create a battery with the other rook on the e-file, a subtle but potentially potent maneuvering idea. A strategic repositioning of the rook to an open file, aiming to bolster the king's safety while also preparing for potential future advances on the kingside, potentially opening lines for attack. Recentering the queen to a more active square is crucial, preparing to contest the open files and support the central pawn push, even if it means sacrificing some kingside attacking potential. Patience now becomes paramount as white reinforces the e-file, preparing for a potential regrouping maneuver and safeguarding the king's immediate vicinity. An attempt to solidify the kingside structure, but it may be a tad too passive, allowing white to consolidate and potentially exploit the slightly weakened pawn chain. Recognizing the pinned knight and its potential downstream effects, this repositioning of the queen offers flexibility, preparing to contest the central e-file should the opportunity arise or provide a defensive retreat if necessary. Black's repositioning of the rook to f8 aims to bolster the kingside defense, a necessary measure given white's recent pawn thrust on h4, which subtly probes for weaknesses around the black monarch. Initiating a knight maneuver to reorient the piece, potentially eyeing the central squares or the kingside from a fresh angle, as white seeks to break the static nature of the position and create new attacking possibilities. Shifting the queen to this square looks like an attempt to break free from its passive positioning, eyeing the kingside for potential activity after some pawn maneuvering. Swapping off the knight on c4 relinquishes black's primary attacking piece on the queenside and simplifies the position, potentially leading towards an endgame where black's slightly passive structure might become more pronounced. Capturing the pawn opens the d-file, creating a vital pathway for your rook and potentially activating your queen along the third rank, while simultaneously clearing space for a more active bishop on c8 should the opportunity arise. reclaiming the central square and preparing to redeploy the queen to a more active role, perhaps aiming for the kingside or supporting a pawn push, is the idea here. Navigating the complexities of this closed position, black's rook repositions, seeking active participation on the e-file, potentially eyeing pressure on the enemy king or supporting a future pawn advance. Initiating a subtle reshuffling of forces to better contest the center and prepare a potential kingside advance. This maneuver seeks to activate the rook that has been observing the action from the f-file, aiming to improve its defensive and offensive potential by freeing up the e-file for other pieces and offering improved coordination with its counterpart on the e-file. Challenging white's grip on the d-file and preparing to contest it with a rook offers a dynamic path forward, aiming to disrupt the opponent's centralized control and potentially open lines for counterplay. Shifting the queen to the open central file, white initiates a forceful positional squeeze, eyeing the enemy king's shelter and potentially preparing a decisive kingside assault by bringing additional artillery to bear. Suddenly, the queens dance into a central skirmish, potentially unbalancing white's well-entrenched position and offering dynamic counterplay on the queen side if white isn't careful about the open d-file. Initiating an exchange at this juncture forces a simplification, potentially paving the way for a more open, albeit simplified, positional struggle where maneuvering becomes paramount and precise piece placement will dictate the flow. Capturing the pawn opens up the c-file, creating a vital corridor for your rooks to exert pressure on white's queenside structure. This transformation of the pawn chain dramatically alters the immediate tactical possibilities and the long-term positional landscape. Shifting the monarch to the center now acknowledges the inherent instability of the pawn structure and aims to leverage the king's newfound activity in the upcoming endgame. Reorganizing the bishop to a more passive square allows white to initiate a central pawn push, potentially opening lines for their rook and bishop. Shifting the rook to the d-file aims to contest control, potentially opening avenues for a pawn push or freeing the other rook for active deployment later. Re-establishing the rook on the 7th rank after a series of exchanges hints at a patient strategy of suffocating white's queenside, while aiming for eventual breakthroughs on the kingside. Repositioning the rook to the d-file initiates a subtle but significant shift, aiming to challenge black's central pawn presence and potentially activate it for future operations on the open d-file. Initiating a central pawn push here to challenge white's space advantage might be more proactive than passively reinforcing the queenside, as your knights are somewhat restricted. Activating the rook on the 7th rank is a sensible endeavor, aiming to penetrate the enemy position and create active threats against the weakened black king or potentially support a pawn advance. The bishop retreats to a more passive square, surrendering control over the crucial dark squares that were being contested, a potentially risky decision as it allows white to solidify their pawn structure and potentially launch an attack on the kingside without immediate counterplay from that piece. Prioritizing kingside expansion, the rook shifts to the g-file, aiming to exploit any potential weaknesses that may arise from black's passive setup. Consolidating the bishop's position onto g7 solidifies the dark-squared defense, aiming to create a fortress against white's potential kingside advances. The grandmasterly maneuvering has led to a symmetrical pawn structure in the center and a rather passive bishop on g7, presenting white with an opportunity to exploit the open d-file and potentially create pressure on black's queenside. A timely repositioning of the king, seeking sanctuary behind the pawn chain while preparing to potentially support a rook maneuver or to avoid any lurking threats on the central files. Re-establishing a presence on the 2nd rank, white aims to consolidate their material advantage and prevent black from achieving any counterplay. This maneuver also prepares for potential pawn advances later on. Reclaiming central influence and seeking better mobility for the monarch, this maneuver repositions the king to a more active square, potentially preparing for its involvement in the pawn structure's defense or to support a future advance. The rooks shuffle back and forth, seemingly without purpose, but this subtle repositioning aims to create a hidden dynamic, perhaps preparing a future advance on the queen side or a strategic redeployment to a more active file, all while maintaining a defensive posture against any potential pawn breakthroughs. Embracing the central open file, the Black King actively seeks active participation in the unfolding positional battle, aiming to escape the confined space of its starting territory and potentially become a decisive piece in the endgame that now looms. Establishing a defensive flank while preparing a potential kingside infiltration. Initiating a bold king march, Black begins a determined advance towards the center, seeking to activate its monarch and potentially exploit the newly opened files as the queens depart the board. Repositioning the rook to the kingside offers defensive support and prepares for potential pawn pushes, aiming to consolidate its position while keeping an eye on Black's centralized king. Shifting the bishop to f8 intends to reinforce the kingside pawn structure and potentially prepare for a regrouping of pieces should White's rook advance further. Reasserting control over the d-file, the rook prepares to challenge Black's passive bishop and potentially shore up the king's safety from that side. Emboldening the bishop to d6 offers a new avenue for piece activity, potentially contesting the d-file or preparing for a more active rook maneuver. Stepping back to defend the rook and reevaluate the central tension, a sensible maneuver to avoid immediate material complications while assessing potential pawn advances or piece repositioning in the cramped queenside. Opening the f-file with this capture immediately targets the White King, aiming to disrupt its newfound safety and potentially expose weaknesses in White's pawn structure. Opening up the d-file now transforms the immediate landscape, giving the rook a clearer path to the 7th rank, potentially forcing concessions or creating tactical opportunities that weren't present with the pawns still blocking the way. Initiating a counterattack on the queen side, 48. Re4 aims to exploit White's isolated d-pawn by activating the rook and potentially creating mating threats. Reactivating the rook on the open file aims to contest control and prevent Black's pawns from advancing further unchallenged. Shifting the rook to the 7th rank now aims to create a passed pawn on the d-file by potentially maneuvering White's defenders and forcing concessions in pawn structure. Unlocking the potential of the open c-file becomes paramount as White endeavors to activate the rook. Embracing dynamism, Black ignites a pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt White's centralized kingside structure and create complex counterplay in what is rapidly transforming into a double-edged endgame. Opening the h-file now offers a potential avenue for White's rook to infiltrate the enemy position, although it simultaneously creates a permanent pawn weakness on g2 that Black might exploit later. Pushing the pawn creates a double-edged sword, opening a path for the rook to potentially penetrate the kingside or offering a pawn sacrifice to gain dynamic counterplay, though it also weakens the pawn structure. Reclaiming the central file becomes paramount as White repositions the rook, aiming to pressure Black's isolated queenside pawns and prepare for potential breakthroughs. The exchange of rooks on the d-file solidifies White's central pawn structure, creating a potential outpost for their knight on d4, while Black aims to activate their remaining rook and potentially challenge the queenside pawns. The rook's relocation secures control of the open file, setting the stage for potential pawn advances and establishing a critical outpost for future action. Sacrificing the rook on the 7th rank opens up the possibility of creating a passed pawn with your king, turning a drawn-looking endgame into a potential victory by leveraging your central pawn majority. Focusing the king centrally prepares for decisive action in the ensuing endgame. Suddenly, Black injects a surprising amount of life into the position with this rook maneuver, aiming to disrupt White's coordination and potentially create downstream complications, forcing a reevaluation of the pawn structure's stability. Challenging the pawn structure in the center, 55. G4 aims to break open lines and activate the White King by creating counterplay. Harnessing the initiative on the kingside, Black injects life into a somewhat static position by advancing the pawn, seeking to disrupt White's consolidated structure and potentially create a passed pawn or open lines for counterplay. Sacrificing the pawn opens a critical diagonal for the king and attempts to dismantle black's pawn shield. Capturing that rook offers an immediate material advantage, but it unravels black's defensive structure, potentially leaving the king exposed and allowing white's advanced pawns to become a serious threat. Opening the f-file injects immediate dynamism, exploiting black's pawn structure and potentially creating threats against the exposed black king. The black king, having been so actively involved in the middle game, now finds itself the focal point of a potential mating net with the white king positioned defensively behind its pawns. This check disrupts white's intended pawn push, forcing a reaction and potentially creating an escape square or a useful tempo. The monarch bravely advances, seeking to anchor itself on a more secure square and prepare for the inevitable pawn push. The sudden surge of black pawns, now spearheaded by this passed c-pawn, completely disrupts white's carefully constructed defensive setup and forces a sharp, immediate reevaluation of its king's safety. Retreating the rook to this square opens a crucial escape route for your monarch should the pawn wall around it crumble further, simultaneously preparing to contest the vital central files and re-establish attacking potential in the opponent's territory. The d-pawn, finally unleashed after a lengthy blockade, surges forward, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create potential passed pawn threats down the queen side, a bold attempt to breathe life into black's position. Unleashing the passed pawn is the immediate priority, aiming to create a disruptive force on the king side, even if it means sacrificing material for tempo. The pawn's determined march to d3 injects a surprising element of dynamism, forcing white to confront a potential passed pawn that could unravel their defenses. Unlocking the passed pawn's potential demands daring, a risky gambit where white sacrifices a rook for a tempo and to prevent black from advancing the devastating pawn further. Sacrificing the rook on f2 offers black a potent passed pawn on the f-file, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and create immediate counterplay in a collapsing position. The advanced pawn on the 7th rank now becomes a potent threat, a phantom of promotion that can disrupt black's entire defensive structure and force concessions.